Thank you, Joel, for joining us.
Thanks.
Could you tell me a little bit more about experimental musician? That's a term that was just used.
What is an experimental musician? Yeah, well, I guess the word experiment is kind of used in so many different contexts, and as a scientist, you would be familiar with experimental methodology, and in music, it's probably got a much looser kind of use. In a sense, historically, it comes from kind of the post-war European and American avant-garde musicians who thought that they could kind of advance music as an art form by doing lots of unconventional things, and probably the most famous musician of that period, John Cage, referred to his music as experimental, literally because he didn't know what would happen when he embarked on composing a piece, or he would use strategies like indeterminacy or chance to set in motion ideas that had uncertain outcomes. But I think that experimental ethos has survived to an extent, but in other ways there's always the danger that people will restage experiments because they've kind of fetishized the effect of them without actually having a truly experimental kind of objective.
So the idea is to make up something completely new that no one's heard of before. Is that true?
The question I ask about an experiment is what are the worthwhile ones? What are the experiments worth undertaking? What are the experiments in which there is something really at stake in the results? So how to think through that as a musician is quite difficult. I mean, how to even think what is at stake in making music today is quite difficult. I can see how with your work there is sort of some really concrete aims and objectives which, if they're realised, they have a measurable effect. But with music, it's and art generally, we're kind of in more ambiguous territory.
There's a whole course at Melbourne University on music therapy as a way of making people happier and healthier, and often I'll read a little bit widely, and people in brain scans actually have the same sorts of activity in their brains as when they are on drugs, when they're listening to music. So I'd like to counter that argument and say I think that there's a huge place in society for music and art in general.
As an alternative to drugs.
Well, perhaps. Can you tell me about an experiment of yours that worked?
That's a good question. I'm sort of, all the failed ones are coming to mind right now. Well, I think Deborah mentioned instrument building, and perhaps that's a good way to talk through the methodology, because when you pick up a musical instrument, as a young person, you not only pick up the instrument but all of the historical baggage that comes along with it, how to play it, it's the classical tradition that produced it and the canonical works that are performed on it. When you invent your own musical instrument, there's no burden of history, there's no tradition attached to it, there's no right or wrong way to play it, and in that sense you carve out a certain autonomy, and that is an experiment which produces a kind of not just new sounds or new kinds of music, but new ways of doing music or new ways of performing the role of musician.
And one of these brand new instruments, what does it look like? I'm a scientist, I need the visual. Can you describe it?
No.
No? It's that experimental. I'm really intrigued now. I should have Googled you more.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
I was really excited to see that you are working on cognitive experiments with mice. And I was thinking about, as someone who's interested in music and then sort of interested in, as an extension of that, sound, and then as an extension of that, listening and speaking, I was wondering if those things are inherently human activities, and whether animals that communicate through sound, whether that ever sort of exceeds mere communication and kind of goes into the field of being musical.
One of the engineers I recently joined arms with, he actually was a musician and still does play, but that was one of the reasons why he's ended up in the field he's in, which is in acoustics. So we are measuring mouse song, and a lot of people don't realise that mice sing, and it's 10 times higher than we can hear. So in the ultrasound. So it's quite phenomenal. The first time you need a special bat recorder, so a microphone that picks up these really upper frequencies, and so you can put that recorder on top of a mouse's cage, and they use it specifically for communication, or so we think. So when they're interacting with each other, or when a pup is calling for its mum to be retrieved, and males in particular use it to seduce females, so it's a mating song, and it's really pretty. So when you shift it down into our hearing range, and when you slow it down as well, it sounds like bird song. And I'm absolutely sure that there are, you just have to look at birds, and even the unique groups of birds that make up new songs every year as their mating song. Music is definitely important for animals, but I'm not sure whether they have the same beat or the same sort of chords, the same styles of music in their communication, but I most certainly think that they use it.
I wonder if where a sound becomes music is where it exceeds its functional kind of role, and it extends into the area of pleasure, where we're just taking pleasure in making sounds and listening to them. And I wonder if it sounds like the way that the mice, for instance, are communicating through sound, it's always functional. It's in order to find a mate or to communicate something specific. I wonder if animals take pleasure in the sounds that they're making and hearing.
That's a really good question. It would be really interesting to have a look and see if the mice that are singing have the same, I guess, the drug areas are in their brain activating. I don't think it's been done before. Can I ask a question?
Please.
Because that sort of led me on to, when you said, is music for pure pleasure or is it communicating? I was lucky enough to work in a jazz club as part of my, I guess, survival during a PhD, and being an observer, I was watching all of the musicians, and especially in the times when they would just free jam, and they're just composing music just from where. I never could work out exactly where they would be pulling these brand new phrases from. And I wondered, it almost looked as if they were in an altered state of consciousness, that they were dreaming while they were drawing on some reserve in their brain to be able to make these new sounds. I wonder if you might be able to help me out there, being a musician.
Yeah, for me, it's music is a language, and in the same way that we are improvising when we speak to one another, searching for the words to articulate what we mean, musical phrases, I think, operate kind of semantically, or there's a musical grammar in which a phrase makes sense to a musician in the way that a sentence does, that it has to have a certain kind of formal arc to it. And the interesting thing, I think, with improvisation as a methodology is that there is a value placed on not repeating yourself or not sort of reproducing the same improvisation. That would go against the logic of this idea of creating something anew. So in that sense, you're both you're in a sort of state where you're intentionally subverting your own instincts. If you always followed impulse, that might lead you to repeat the same expressions over and over. So how do you improvise, not just freely, but against your own impulses? I think that's kind of an interesting question that improvisation asks of music. Is how can it be a force for continually advancing musical thinking rather than be a kind of self-indulgent thing that just is sort of about expressing yourself, whether you have something urgent to say or not?
speaking of improvising, a lot of the musicians I was watching, they'd close their eyes and they'd get funny little twitches in their face. Does that mean that it isn't just a conversation? Because as we do converse, we have eye contact and we listen to the other person. And I know that you have to do that while improvising, but is there some other space, another realm that you go to while in that state of creating new music?
I mean, the act of playing music is very embodied. I mean, the body does sort of strange and unpredictable things, both pragmatically in order to, produce the physical gesture that is required to create the sound, but also as a byproduct of intensely concentrating. A lot of musicians are prima donnas, though, and what to you might look like an accidental twitch has probably been practiced in front of the mirror a million times. Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah, sure.
It seems like a great opportunity to say something about the link between autism and enhanced musical capabilities, savantism especially, but why it is that musicians, that so many great musicians have had Asperger's or been on the autism spectrum and had these sort of incredible capacity to perform musically.
That's an absolutely fascinating area, and there's a book that's out. I think it might be Guitar 0 to 10. To Hero, and it's the concept about it is if you spend 10,000 hours on any particular task, you will become a genius in that particular task. So
Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that concept is, I guess, why some people become fantastic at a particular thing, be it an art form or a musical instrument. One of the ways of describing autism is most children and adults have what we call repetitive and restrictive behaviours. And this is a particular behaviour that means that they focus in on one thing. And it could be, as a toddler, they're obsessed with trains. And all they want to do is drive trains around and around and around. And that is a really satisfying task for them. As an adult, some of these behaviours actually express themselves in different ways. So the train becomes less salient, and maybe it's focusing on one particular research topic. So one of the children I worked with was really obsessed with busting myths, and he'd just done the Loch Ness Monster, and he was completely all over that. The Loch Ness Monster does not exist, but the New Jersey Devil, that was the one that we had to research together, and he obsessively put all of his energy into library research on the New Jersey Devil. Now, maybe that's one of the reasons why people, be it if they do have autism or not, actually become fantastic at one particular thing, because they sort of almost like draft horses put their little blinkers on and just focus on that one particular task. So that could be the reason. And I've reflected a lot on why that happens. And a lot of very young children with autism have sensory overload. So you've probably seen a family who have a child with autism out in public, and it's their child that's screaming and losing it. And I think all of us have seen that and gone, wow, that must be really hard. But imagine that every single day. So what makes a child scream and lose it in a way that is absolutely, it looks really distressing for them. And I learned something very interesting actually by reading a blog of someone from New Zealand who's an artist with autism. And she said she can't go to the 7-Eleven and pick up a receipt. So you know that really shiny paper that we always print receipts on? That hurts her.
Yep.
And she actually drops it because it's actually physically painful for her. And I couldn't understand how that would happen, but the way that she processes the sense of feeling that paper in between her fingers is completely different to someone who wouldn't find that painful. So maybe it's a sensory overload that means that someone wants to focus in on one thing. A train that goes round and round, they can control that. They know where their environment is. They can predict the sound of that train on the tracks. So it could be one of the reasons why we have absolute geniuses in our society, and also why some of those geniuses are autistic.
The conversation before was sort of about mobile phones, and I was thinking that the ability to focus and concentrate is almost like the number one skill that you can have today, because it's the thing that is sort of that we're all in deficit of. Our sort of levels of our concentration spans have shrunk so much. So it's kind of interesting that perhaps people with autism are, in a way, the last group who are able to fully concentrate on the task at hand, while the rest of us kind of flit from email to email and tab to tab.
Yep, that's a good point. I think the screen time that we're exposed to is most certainly a brand new thing, and a lot of people are trying to make links between autism and screen time, and I think that we're really in our infancy when we make those sorts of links, that screen time can cause problems. I definitely know that I do struggle with attention occasionally when I'm constantly checking if it's social media or emails, and I often turn off my phone as a way of giving myself respite, and I think that's because I'm just on the cusp of the generation that didn't have computers when we were young enough to sort of misuse them. So as a teenager, that's when I had my first computer. So I think I'm lucky in that sense that I've got that control, and that's something that I try and train my stepchild to be able to turn off the iPad. That's just as powerful as being able to turn it on and then search whatever you want. And that's really powerful too. So I think that using screens in a positive way, so to be able to explain a kayak in just 2 seconds to a 5-year-old is really exciting. So we can do that, but as long as we turn it off and then get back into the real world and have conversations, I think that's the trick to not completely losing our ability to focus on something for too long.
I agree.
Yeah.